So we now need a way to access all of these view objects in code. And specifically, we need to be able to access these in the view controller. Remember that our first view controller here is not being managed by a viewcontroller.swift file. Only our second one is. So we can't hook up any of these elements, right? And if you are trying to hook up elements from here and it's working from here, you manage to flip these, right? You set the class here. If we take a look at the identity inspector for our first view controller here, you've set the class here to view controller instead of the second one, which should be view controller. So you want to make sure the second one here is set to view controller. And let's go ahead and open up our project navigator here. And we're going to hold down the Alt key and we're going to press on view controller. Alt key, click on view controller. That's going to bring up our assistant editor here and close out of these additional panels. We don't need them right now. And that way we'll be able to see the viewcontroller.swift file and our storyboard side by side. Now, the goal here is going to be to hook up our UI elements to our view controller, and this will basically give our view controller access or a way to reference all of the view objects we've added here. So we have to hook them up one at a time. And the first one we're going to hook up is our label here. We're going to make sure that we have our label selected in our view controller scene. Sometimes it's a little hard to select here because we set it to hidden. So it's really easy to see it in our view controller scene here. We're going to make sure we have our label selected. Now it's really important to make sure you have the right UI element selected. If you have the wrong one selected, let's say you have your text field selected or you have your view selected, this is a really common error. This isn't going to work properly. So make sure you have the right UI element selected, and we're going to make sure this is our label. And can be a little tricky the first time you do it, but we're going to be doing this literally hundreds of times. So we're going to get a lot of practice with this. We're going to hold down the control key here, right, with our label. We see it's blue. And we're going to drag over to our view controller here, right under the class view controller. And we're going to release. It's going to say insert outlet or outlet connection. So if you're up here, you don't have that. If you're in the middle of this function here, if you did load, it's not going to work. It's not going to work down here. It will work here, but we want to put it right here for organization purposes. So you're going to release, and we're going to see this little menu pop up, and it's going to say connection outlet. You also have the option to select outlet connection. This is if you want to hook up multiple UI elements simultaneously. We're not going to really be using this. We're going to use the outlet. We next need to give this a name, and this is the name we're going to be using to reference this label we added to our storyboard in code. So we're basically just going to give this an identifier, and this identifier is going to be message label. And we're going to leave the type as UI label, and that's the type of UI element. That's the name of this UI element. And the storage type is going to be weak. Now we see we have a drop down. We could make this strong. The default is going to be weak. This has to do with the pointer type. It's going to contain a weak reference. Our view controller is going to have a weak reference to this element. The reason for that is it's held by the storyboard. We don't need to create another strong pointer to keep it in memory. Little advanced. For now, we just need to know that we need to leave this as weak, and this is going to be the default anyway. So, unless you explicitly go change it, it'd be a little difficult to mess this up. So, we're going to make sure that our name is message label here, and we're going to click connect. And we should now see at IB outlet, weak var message label : UI label ! And this is basically the way that we can create a reference to a UI element. And actually, if we hover over what's called our circle in the gutter here, this is called the gutter, we see that it'll actually highlight our label, right? So if this is empty for some reason, and it's not highlighting this UI element, you've got a problem, right? So right now we see that this is filled up and we properly hooked up this UI element. The next thing we want to do is we want to hook up our text field. So let's grab our text field here, and we're going to control drag in. We're going to do this right below. Now we don't want to do this on top, right? We want to make sure we keep these things ordered. So we're going to do this right below, and we're going to select outlet, and the name is going to be enter name text field. And the type is going to be UI text field. This is a UI text field. The last type was UI label. And the storage type is going to be weak once again, and this is once again going to be an outlet. And we can connect this up. And we'll talk about what code is being generated when we finish hooking up our UI elements here. So we have one more we want to hook up, and that's going to be our enter message text field. Now, we're not going to be using this for quite a while. We're going to have this actually in a challenge. But once again, I'm going to make sure I have my view UI element selected here, and I'm going to control drag in, right? So UI element selected, confirm that my view controller scene, hold down the control key and drag in. So we're going to call this one enter, and we're going to say message text field. So let's talk about what was generated here. Well, we have this at IB outlet keyword here, and this basically says that there's some UI element in our storyboard that we're referencing here. It's just a helper for the compiler. And the second thing we have here is the weak keyword, and this is just basically defining what type of pointer this is. This is going to be a weak pointer. And we don't really need to worry about that. We're going to be using weak pointers for all of our IB outlets in the future. Strong storage has its uses, but not for our IB outlets. And then we're going to use this var keyword. And this is basically just saying that this is going to be a variable. And we haven't talked about variables yet. We'll absolutely get into that. This is just part of what's being generated here. And then our name, the way we're going to reference this in code, is going to be able to say message label. So when we start typing in our function later, message label, we're going to be referring to our label here. And when we type in enter name text field, we're going to be referring to our text field. And when we type in enter message text field, we're going to be referring to our last text field here. And then we have this colon UI label exclamation point. Well, hopefully this doesn't seem too scary. I know it's brand new. You've never really seen code before potentially. But all this is saying is that we're specifying that this type is going to be a UI label, right? And that makes sense. This is a label. And we're saying that the next two are going to be text fields. And we just have to separate these by colons. That's just part of the syntax. It's just like learning grammar for any language. You'll get used to it. We're going to do this quite a bit. And we're going to go over explicitly what this is doing, right? This is explicitly defining the type here. So the final thing we're doing is we're adding an exclamation point. And this has to do with optionals. We're basically saying we're going to unwrap this optional now. Because it's from the storyboard, we know that it exists, assuming it's connected properly. So again, if that seems confusing, we're going to have a whole lesson on optionals. And basically, this is automatically being generated when we're creating our connections. So what you really need to take away from this lesson is, how do I connect things up? Well, I make sure I have the right elements selected. I'm going to make sure I don't have my views selected. I'm going to make sure I have, my UI element, be it my text field or my label, and I'm going to control drag in, holding down the control key while I drag. And I'm also going to make sure that I don't do something like this in the future, where I grab one of these connections and I hook this up to my enter name text field, because if I did that, then this connection would be connected to two things, right? And we don't want that. We want to make sure that we're connecting each element to one of these IB outlets. So if we hover over it, we only see one of these things highlighted. So that's a good way to check to make sure this is working. And we see that these are all filled in, which means our connections are working as well. Now, we have one additional type of connection we're going to be making here. And that's, we're going to do this with our button here. And we're going to generate a function. And functions are basically a bit of code that runs, and specifically the code that will run when we press this button here. If that sounds a little confusing, we're going to, again, have a whole lesson on functions. I know I keep saying these things, but I just don't want anyone to panic or, worry about what's coming in the future. Right now, we just need to follow along, make sure we understand the key concepts, and then we're going to have plenty of chances to explain what's going on in the future. So when we have our send mail button selected in our storyboard here, in our view controller scene, we're going to once again control drag. Now this time we're going to drag in below did receive memory warning. And right now we see that the information that pops up is a little bit different than when we had our other UI elements. We have insert outlet action or outlet connection. Before we only had insert outlet or outlet connection. So we have this additional action, and that's exactly what we want to make here. So we're going to release, and we're going to change the connection type to an action. Yes, we can make our button an IB outlet, and that would be if we wanted to change the look or, the text of our button. But right now, we only care about when we press the button, we want something to occur. So that's an action. And we're going to name this action send mail button pressed. And this kind of goes back to our naming convention here. We've seen this used a few times, so I'm just going to explain this now. In Swift, it's really common to use camel case, which basically means we capitalize the letter after the first word when we have additional words here. So M is capitalized, button is capitalized, and pressed is capitalized here. And the reason we don't capitalize the first letter is we reserve capital first letters for class names. So view controller here is capitalized, UI label is capitalized, and we haven't talked about classes yet, but I'm just telling you, so when you hear about classes later on, maybe it'll trigger in your mind that, class names are capital. For now, we're going to be using lowercase until I instruct you to explicitly use a capital letter. So this also with camel case, in some programming languages, you see underscore used a lot, and it's technically valid to use underscore, but Apple really uses camel case. iOS development, it's really common to see camel case used, so I'm going to show you this course using camel case. That's what we're going to be using. Now, the type here, we're going to actually use the drop down. We're going to select a UI button. If you left this as any object, it wouldn't make any difference. We're not going to be using this type, but it's nice to explicitly define this as UI button. And then we're going to leave the defaults here for the event is going to be touch up inside. This is just the event that we're looking for. So the way the user presses this button, we could change this. So, touch drag outside, they have to touch and drag to the outside, or touch drag inside. We're just going to use touch up inside. We're going to touch up inside the button. And then we're also going to choose for the arguments is going to be the sender here. So there's some other options, none and sender an event. And once again, if you chose either one of these other options, it wouldn't make any difference for the code we're going to be writing. But, this is going to be pretty standard, the options we're choosing here. So I'm going over them so that when you see these in the future, it'll seem way more familiar. So we're going to connect this up, and we're going to see that this is going to generate some different code here. We're going to have this at IB action instead of the at IB outlet keyword, which basically means that this is going to be an action. Or when I press the button, some functionality should run. And what functionality should run? Well, anything in between these two curly braces, any code we write, will run when we press this button. So notice that this function is defined below the did receive memory warning. We're not defining it inside. And that we have these two curly braces that are automatically generated. Now, we named this function, and we're using this func keyword to define that it's a function. Send mail button pressed, and it has one parameter, and the parameter's name is sender, and it's going to pass in the UI button. What does that mean? Well, when we actually press the button, this function is going to run, which means anything inside of here will run, and we'll have access to a parameter or a variable named sender, which will be the button. Basically, what happens is when we press this button, it passes itself into the function in case we want to do something with it. So when we press the button, we could say, okay, I want to change the button's background color to be red. So we could do sender dot background color is equal to UI color dot red color. Now, once again, we didn't actually write this out. We're not going to be doing that. I'm just trying to explain in case you're really curious what this boilerplate code is doing. What you really need to know is that for our button, we need to create an IB action, and we need to use the defaults that we set up. So that's it for this video. The real point of this was to get comfortable creating connections, understand that when we select a UI element, we hold down the control key, drag in, and we're going to either choose an outlet connection or an IB action connection. And we were only able to generate an IB action for our button.